Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today's conversation is about one of the biggest shifts happening in enterprise IT right now. It's the rapid evolution of managed network services in the age of AI, automation, and integrated security. Gartner just released their 2026 research on managed network services and the Magic Quadrant a few days ago. And they make it really clear that the providers are in a race to modernize service delivery platforms with AI, and that market is also moving well beyond traditional monitoring and support towards more predictive, automated, and outcome driven operations. They also point to security as one of the largest and fastest growing areas in managed network services, while signaling that AI agents and autonomous assurance will increasingly shape how networks are operated by the end of the decade. So today we're going to explore what all of that really means for IT leaders, specifically how AI is changing the definition of what managed means, how automation translates into measurable business value, why security has become central to modern business value and network strategy, and what governance and accountability and execution need to look like in a more autonomous environment today. We'll also unpack why XTIUM was recognized as a leader for the fourth consecutive year in the 2026 Gartner Magic Quadrant for Managed Network Services, and why it was positioned highest for the ability to execute, why it was ranked number one in automation and AI, security, and secure network access for 2026 research. I'm also excited to get into this discussion because really for IT leaders in 2026, this isn't really about technology adoption. This is about operating models and risk and resilience and how to move faster without losing control. To help us unpack all of this, I'm joined by two of our terrific leaders from XTIUM. First, it's Walt Walker, Chief Revenue Officer here at XTIUM, who brings forth that frontline view into what customers are asking for right now, from simplification and accountability to business outcomes and execution. And also joined by Mike Davis, Senior Product Architect over here at XTIUM, who brings that deeper expertise in the architecture, automation, and secure capabilities that are really reshaping the modern network managed services. So, Walt and Mike, thank you for both being here. Let's jump right into it. So, Walt, let me start with you. I've always found you to be a bit of a unicorn, coming up as a network engineer, running the NOC, involved in both product and strategy at multiple companies, and now heading up sales and revenue. Kind of gives you a unique take on the world. How, as you talk with customers and what you're seeing in the market, what do you think IT leaders are taking away from this year's Gartner research, especially around service delivery platforms and things like AI automation and security?
Right. No, so I think ultimately the three key takeaways I can think about are first. I think IT leaders are somewhere in the gap between where AI is going to be and what it is today in managed network services. And I think the gap between IT leaders and everyone else just got a little bit wider, right? Not because of price, but mostly because of platform, right? The providers winning right now have made real investments in what the platform capabilities are, right? And deep with automation and AI baked in. Now that's table stakes, more of a differentiator nowadays. So second, I think security is officially pulled in the network. Managed security is growing ultimately at a significant pace. An EMS provider ultimately still treating security as a separate work stream is legitimately in a spot where it's left behind. So I think IT leaders understand that. And I think third, um, one of the most important things is ultimately people are still an important component of this. Gartner explicitly identifies things like 20% of organizations with M&S do it for themselves ultimately within the organizations. Still within that context, people are still an important component of that, right? So agentic AI is important, but human in the loop still in those conversations, I think are an important factor that every MSP, along with the platform, that those are important takeaways now that IT leaders are constantly identifying in the landscape.
Yeah, that's good. So, Mike, over to you. I think from a product and architecture perspective, how do you see AI fundamentally changing managed network services, particularly as it relates to the word managed? Like, what does managed mean in sort of this new AI discussion?
It definitely will fundamentally change what managed means, but probably not in the way that most folks think about. Gartner's predicting that 20% of organizations will, shift from M&S to DIY by 2030 after they adopt agentic NetOps. And that's an existential prediction for this industry, that's for sure. Vendors vendors are building AI into their products. Cisco, Fortinet, Palo Alto, et cetera, are giving enterprises tools to self-manage. M&S providers who survive, I think, will be ones whose AI does something that vendor native tools can't do, and that is correlate across multiple vendors, across multiple domains, multiple technology layers simultaneously. That's what you would call cross-domain intelligence, and I think it requires a platform that sits above any single vendor, and that's what XTIUM AI does. We're really good at that.
Gartner leads off its 2026 Magic Quadrant for M&S by saying that managed network services providers are racing to upgrade their service delivery platforms with AI and improve performance to gain a competitive edge. How do you guys view that? Like, how is it fundamentally changing M&S? How would you kind of look at what the market is saying, what the customers are saying when you're talking to customers on a daily basis? How are they sort of thinking about this?
So go ahead, Walt.
So from the perspective of, let's call it the CIO down to the engineering levels, right? I think AI is changing what customers buy. For example, 5 years ago, customers bought, mostly against headcount, right? So ultimately, an MSP, a component that we offered, was the ability to provide operational context, support an adjunct component of your team. Today, customers buy more so for outcomes, right? So, the headcount is almost invisible in the conversation. And the question is no longer how many engineers we have watching alerts. The question is how fast the platforms can decide and act, and then how quickly can they enable those people to make good decisions around the context of what's happening around the network, right? So AI is sort of quickly compressing the value of what would be sort of generalized as standard services to basically down to zero, right? So customers are paying for, premiums around quickly identifying what incidents are, how we operationalize them, and ultimately MSPs that survive in the context of that are the ones that use AI to free their people up for strategic purposes and conversations that actually, add more value and move and shift that customer's business forward. Just, I think those are some important components of the operational context of how AI is shifting M&S.
Yeah, and I would say from my point of view, I'm a service delivery platform that supports those business objectives needs to take in a complex set of information out of a customer's environment and prepare it, identify what's broken and prepare that for remediation. And then remediate if possible. The remediation can happen via automation. It can happen via through NOC personnel, both of which are reasonably expensive. Obviously, there are people costs, which are kind of obvious, but even automations have their own risks and expenses with them. Whether you're burning tokens to run an agent or you're introducing operational risk by pointing that automation at the wrong thing. The robot goes and it fixes something that isn't broken. That's an expensive risk. What we found is that there are really kind of two ways that, at least from a technical perspective, that AI is changing M&S. And a lot of people either conflate or confuse them. And the first one is an important distinction, is deterministic AI versus generative AI and agentic AI, both of which are very powerful in their own ways, but they solve really different problems. Deterministic AI is a set of mathematical models. They analyze telemetry, they correlate events, they identify potential root cause. And flavors of this have been in production at advanced M&S providers for years. So it's what turns 50 alarms into one instant. It's not glamorous, it's not pretty, but it definitely drives FCR rates and repair times. And the second, which is the kind of the hot topic of the day, getting all the headlines, would be the generative and agentic AI. These are technologies that are like much earlier stage. It's useful for natural language interfaces, incident narrative generation, configuration assistance. But the flip side of it is that it is dangerous, potentially dangerous for operational decisions because it can hallucinate. Right? It's not good for root cause because it's at best probabilistic. The NOC still has to go through the effort of taking the probable answers that the AI provides. But I think root cause, 75% likelihood of root cause A, 30% root cause B, the NOC still has to triage and repair that. And an automation needs clarity before it knows which of those root causes to fire off against. If you get the wrong answer in network operations, you get an outage, or you get a delay at least till the return of service. So the providers who understand this distinction, they use deterministic AI for decisions and generative AI for augmentation are the ones Gartner is rewarding. And it is that understanding and that implementation and that powerful implementation is why Gartner ranked us number one in this year's survey. And we actually got a perfect score in that measure in this last in 2025's award.
Can you guys think of a customer just recently where you've seen that kind of value add, right? So like what I hear a lot about, from both of you is, look, a lot of the basic blocking and tackling, right, is moving into, the low level, like high volume kind of alerts being triaged. You're offloading and freeing up, knock time and resources so that they can focus more on what I'm going to call, predictive, maybe, and strategic operations, right? Can you think of a customer recently where that's, you've had conversation or they've come to you with a particular problem, where you're looking at, yeah, that's exactly what's happening right now. That's exactly what we're seeing.
So I will say that largely every customer we onboard finds themselves suddenly becoming aware of how much more stuff is broken in their environment that needs to be addressed by the NOC. So there's this remedial period that always happens. And we have phenomenally low churn rates. Customers who come on board love the service they receive and are very happy with it. That's kind of broad and across the board. We tackle some of the most difficult technologies to manage, whether it's on-premise voice systems that require network management, security management, compute, and OS and application, and all laid out in complex geographical relationships. And we do it in such a way that drives customer sat really, really high. And I would point out that the reason I say that customers are surprised when they come on board is because we, unlike many of our competitors, let me back up. There are really a couple ways to reduce noise that you have to deal with as an M&S provider, and noise being events and alarms that don't lead to a root cause or remediation. One is to block them out at the door. That is to filter them out and ignore them. Right? The most extreme example would be on a noisy application to just decide to ping it to see if it's alive. That doesn't tell you anything about the health of it, but it tells you whether or not it's reachable. Because of our proprietary AI-ML combination, we're able to richly instrument against that application or that infrastructure. And so we see things that are broken. We bring in kind of a net new information to the NOC and to the customer that they probably haven't seen with another provider. And yet, because we're able to do such an effective job of noise reduction and root causing and automation, it doesn't seem to impact our NOC's performance. That would be the most common way that it helps, even in those complex environments.
I would agree, Mike. I think that's where the real value shows up, right? So freeing the NOC from those repetitive triage tasks, and ultimately they can focus on what proactive optimization looks like. And that creates sort of a higher order problem solving value, right? It's not just efficiency, it's, elevating the skill mix with our operational context and brings quality across the entire operation. So I think not just tangentially what customers experience. I think that's part and core to the principle of our ability to execute in the space.
That's good. So let's move on to security. Well, according to Gartner, managed security is the fastest growing segment inside of M&S. Whether you're talking about SASE, XDR, threat hunting, like these are all the expanding, those are the ones that are expanding the fastest. Like, how do you think about it? Like, what are customers talking to you about as you're working?
So I think there's a mix of this and sort of how engineers and CIOs and CTOs think in terms of sort of how we look at the context of security inside of M&S, right? So I think security becomes more important for a couple of reasons. I think there's a number of reasons, but I think there are two things that we hear pretty consistently, right? First, the threat surface has significantly exploded in the last year, right? So security is always at top of mind, but every device, every cloud, every remote worker, every new component of an application is a new attack vector. So attackers are using AI faster, right, than most defenders are, right? So that's a component, and so I think that resonates with the technical teams. That resonates with the C-suite that's responsible to sort of articulate back to the business what the protection vectors are in the business. And then second, network and security have become more complex, but that complexity is converged. So you cannot maintain and really manage a modern network without managing security. There's no such thing as managing a firewall, but not managing the security of that firewall from SASE, XDR, ZTNA, all live in the same fabric now. So I think when a customer thinks about what that means, when it needs a NOC and a SOC, they talk together, right? They're still the appropriate barriers, right, in terms of communication, but those two components are integrated in a modern MSP. And I think that's an important component of, things like secure network access services, right? So we've built an integrated, that kind of a model, from the start. And now those two practices are effectively stitched together. They're inextricably linked with how customers think about the context of security.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And to harp on a theme, for the NOC that is supporting these environments, we suddenly have yet another source of noise, another source of potential confusion or duplicated effort or inefficiency that comes out of what happens when you're experiencing denial of service in an environment. You start seeing traditional M&S triggers like high CPU or bandwidth utilization impacts or other sorts of events. And traditionally, you would treat them one way, right? But now that you have to expect that there's going to be a security element there that you're watching. It's yet another thing that has to be root caused and sorted out. It doesn't stop the SOC from doing SOC work to isolate and chase down the source of the problem or address the problem as they typically would. But the risk is that if you don't do those kinds of correlation and automations, you end up having the NOC chasing their tail for a security incident that they really ought not be having to deal with. And to Walt's point, all of these devices now, SD-WAN devices, have embedded firewalls, and SASE architectures put security functions at the network edge. So everything is exposed now. It's much less a case where you have peripheral devices that are at a higher security risk and internal trusted networks that are at a lower security risk. Those architectures are going away. So we have to be watching everywhere for security as well as availability concerns.
And I'm sure you remember this, Mike. There was a point in time in both our careers that I'm sure we've heard the NOCs and SOCs don't really talk to each other, right? Those days have to gone because they need to be able to communicate what's happening, at the network layer and what's happening within the security context, because they're, again, they're linked to something potentially at the broader aspect of, supporting overall security.
Yeah, and so to that point, right? We carefully instrumented our traditional M&S delivery platform to watch for security events, to eliminate and deduplicate events, and we also leverage a more agentic AI up at the ITSM layer to make sure that tickets, work tickets that do come through, are properly correlated and hydrated and prepared for the eventual recipient, if it is a human, to deal with those tickets. And if it's not a human, then there's enough context to fire off the appropriate automation.
And Mike, you'd mentioned just earlier in the discussion about how you look at what it's good at today. What AI is good at today is identification, right? Consolidation, making sure that there's correlation. But then you also talked about how they have the ability to hallucinate, right? And that kind of comes back to governance, right? When you think about and Gartner pulled this out as well, and they said, look, if you really think about it, closed loop autonomous assurance is coming by, and they're saying 2030. What governance frameworks do you see that really need to be in place for these organizations to really be able to do self-healing inside of their networks?
Well, I'll speak from a platform perspective, because that is probably one of our most clever results of our approach of separating deterministic and probabilistic AIs. Right out of the box, we provide, and for all of our customers, a closed loop machine learning approach to dealing with root cause and automation functionality. We don't need to make a single LLM call to sort out those kinds of problems. Where we leverage the LLMs are in subsequent analyses that we might be looking at a set of events for a new ML model, right? And that does a few things for us. One is it allows us, between that and our on-premise deployment model, we can be completely closed loop with all of this intelligence out of the box. Where it gets more interesting is if we can, if periodically we want to update or improve on those ML models on a customer premise, for example, then you have these other governance things come into play. But that's not a requirement to deploy our model or deploy our platform. So that makes it easy. I don't know, Walter, you had something you want to cover there?
Yeah, no, I'll add some thought and I agree, Mike. I think those are the right, context of not only what we built, but what, agents can do today. And I think as we kind of look into the future, you can shift from sort of the identification and triage to, agents will in the context of 2030 could very easily in that pathway handle deterministic components, right? Configuration changes, path selection, deployment, route policy enforcement, first line incident triage, right? That's the 80% of what managed network services components are that follow those rules at the end of the day, right? So I think as agents get more, training data, right, specifically in the context of M&S, then I think deterministic components could be there. Now, I'm going to use the big never word. I think agents should not, in the right network, would not and should not do is anything related to human judgment about business context, interrelationships, organizational risk. Again, I think the model behaviors are obviously getting better as we go, but I think ultimately, I don't see a world where there's not an important contextual human in the loop component of managed network services. And I think agents shouldn't really decide whether to take down or, a specific platform within the organization. Maybe you're, part of a healthcare organization and, the EMR system needs a component of policy adjustment, right? I don't think that's a decision that an agent would make in business context, right? Obviously would understand things like market hours, but deciding whether that security event gets escalated to your CISO at 3 a.m., that's the right deterministic conversation for a human to make a decision about how that works, right? In terms of the context of security. So I think the line is relatively simple: automate the work, support governance of the decisions, not necessarily execute those decisions without enough business context, relational context about what's happening. And I think that bleeds into, Mike, some of the accountability, right? Technology is moving faster than, the operating models are at the end of the day. So most MSPs are kind of sitting in this context of they can't actually answer the question sometimes of like, if something goes wrong, who's responsible? So I think with all these components of human, agent, model, behavior, customer, vendor, these are still important contextual outputs. Until that question is clear, I think agentic AI in production environments is going to keep hitting a little bit of that friction, right? So I think it's a mix of it'll get there by 2030, do more deterministic work, but I think there's still some friction to work through. And I think that's where the next wave of M&S innovation has to happen. It's not in AI itself, but in the contracts, the SLAs, the audit frameworks, the commercial alignment, right? That's the boring middle ground, the work that nobody really wants to do, but we know it needs to be done. And I think that's where, that layer of accountability will support that agentic work heading into more deterministic work in the future, is figuring out what's the accountability model look like, with all this at the end of the day.
Yeah, I would agree. And in terms of, where, where that is today, I think if you want to do routine config changes, you want to, certificate renewals, firmware compliance checks, those kinds of things, a lot of config management and what have you. Those are, people are doing that now. That's not a problem. I think by 2030, nobody can really predict the future, and some of these things may accelerate, but you could start seeing proposals from an agent for change. Walt's point, you're going to want a human approval on that, partly because humans bring wisdom and humans bring innovation. Neither are things that large language models bring today. And then, I don't know, by 2030, there's a lot of people talking about expecting to see root cause, spanning overlay, underlay, app layers, those kinds of things. But again, the cost of a wrong decision in those is still too high. LLMs are essentially probabilistic always. They have to be, because that's how they choose the next word that they provide you. It's a likely root cause, and likely root causes aren't good for actions in the knock. You want to be fairly certain before you make a change, before you adjust the environment. So that's kind of where I fall there. In terms of governance, though, I think that you're going to start seeing, we're seeing actually and implementing blast radius containment concerns. Determine any autonomous action needs to, you need to know its maximum impact, right? And that's whether it's ML driven or it's AI driven, and it's the trip line that always takes knocks from really excited about the automations they're going to create until they burn themselves by an inappropriate blast radius, and then they'll kind of back off and fall back on traditional config management, change management type practices. You're always going to want to position your deterministic AI before your probabilistic, for reasons I've said a few times here. Our deterministic AI runs in the 90 to 95% accurate, which none of the probabilistic ones, agentic ones we're seeing from the competitors or from the market, come close to. And we were affirmed in that by Gartner's decision. We're going to want a human in the loop always for irreversible actions. Any change that can't be automatically rolled back within seconds ought to require human approval. We have the technology to validate automatically, but again, the rollback has to be, if it's that risky, then it can't be rolled back quickly in an automated fashion. It needs a human in there. I guess those are the ones come top of mind.
Walt and Mike, thanks to both of you for a really thoughtful and I think timely discussion. And to me, a few things really stood out from today's conversation. One is that AI is changing managed network services from a reactive support to more of a predictive and intelligent operations. Also, that automation really only matters when it produces real business outcomes. Another thing would be that security is no longer adjacent to network operations, but really central to it. And then also that, that autonomy, as it increases, governance and accountability becomes more important, not less. Right. So like for IT leaders, really, to me, the message is pretty clear. It's that the future of managed network operations won't be defined by tools or features, but really by the ability to simplify complexity, improve our resilience, and then also strengthen security and deliver measurable outcomes with confidence. And that's exactly really why conversations like this one matter. So thanks to everybody for joining us. And if you're interested, we'll be happy to send you a copy of the Gartner 2026 Managed Network Services Report. Just reach out to me and I'm happy to send it over your way. Thanks, everybody.